Welcome back for those of you who were with me yesterday, and welcome for those of you who are new. Today we're going to be talking about Blender again. Blender embeds a Python interpreter. Not just any Python interpreter, mind you. Blender only works with the absolute most recent release of Python, which is 3.2. Doesn't work with older Python, which annoys a lot of people, but when you say stuff like Blender only works with Python 3 at PyCon, then people cheer wildly. Because it's another example of Blender doing the right thing, right? Like, and being kind of an excellent example of what to do. Because everyone should migrate to Python 3, and some projects are kind of slowly making their way there, but Blender is there. And today, I'm going to hopefully teach you how to automate a few things in Blender. I have a handful of scripts that I've already authored. We're going to kind of walk through each of those and kind of talk about the different bits and pieces and the hows and whys of how to get those into Blender and how to make them work. And then I'll show you a script that I've actually authored and used to accomplish a very specific task. And then I want to add some functionality to that script using what we talked about at the beginning of the lecture. That should take us the whole hour, possibly more, but we'll see how much we can get through. That last bit I've actually not done before, so not only is it just a live demo, it's live talk content generation. So anyway, hopefully I don't bore you guys, and hopefully you learn something. So, the first thing to do when you're doing anything with the Blender Python API is make sure you launch Blender correctly. So if you go here and surf to where the Blender, wherever your Blender app is, I built from source, and so I've got it here in this directory, right? Blah, 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 blah. There it is, Blender app. If you're double clicking on this, you're doing it wrong. Please to be starting it from the command line.
Windows too?
For Windows, Windows I think by default starts with the terminal window in the background. It's been like all over half a decade since I've used Windows with regularity, so I've never actually used Blender on Windows. I just realized how snotty that sounded. I usually use Linux though, so I'm not one of these Apple fanboys. Despite how things look. So here we are, at least in Apple OS X land. An app file is just a directory. Can you guys see that? Here we are, blender.app. It's just a directory. So cd into blender.app. So for those of you on a real Unix, you'll just add the Blender binary to the path, right? And just launch it that way, or do the absolute path. So here we are. This is a Blender executable. File, Blender. All 70 megs of it. Okay? You'll notice a few things. There's the executable, and then there's this directory, 2.63. Here is my machine at home that I used to develop Blender, just running some Linux, right? If you go into a hidden folder in your home directory called Blender, you'll notice, again, this 2.62, 2.63 stuff. This is where Blender looks for its configuration. Okay, and inside you'll see a config directory, a scripts directory, etc., etc. On Windows, once again, I'm not really sure where it's going to put that information, but that directory ends up being important-ish. Well, we'll get to that when we get to it. So, there's a couple different ways that you can interact with Blender using its API. I'm going to start the one I know least about. So when you start up Blender, and the key combination is Control and then hit the right arrow a few times. I guess it doesn't work on my machine. Or you come up here and you go to scripting. So top of the screen, see where it says window sort of icon, default, and you come down to scripting. And things kind of change, and you get this thing here on the left is a text area, like a text editor, loosely speaking. If you come in here, you can say print hello world. All right? And if you, oh my gosh. Please excuse me while I set up a mouse. If you grab this, oh gosh. If you grab this window here and drag, there's a little button called Run Script. When you run script and go back to your terminal, look, hello world. So run script, I'm going to hit it a bunch of times. Look, all these hello worlds. All right? So what you could do is anything you wanted to get Blender to run, you could find a script online or whatever, you copy it, you come in here, you paste it in here, and then you just hit run. Boosh. And all the output will go to your terminal. So that's an okay way to do it if you like this text editor. I have found that I prefer using different text editors, and so I usually do it the way I will show you in a little bit. So the other way you can interact with Blender from the command line, or excuse me, through their API, is down here, this Python Interactive Console. Can you read that ish? Yeah. I'll try not to linger on it because I don't know that I have very much control over the font size. But so import sys print sys.
You can control and scroll up. That'll zoom in on it. Right, down for that.
Down for the, yeah. That was frustrating yesterday. I mean, you could do anything in here, right? Import NumPy if you have that installed on the Python that Blender is using, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So import, let's see, bpy dot, and I can't remember if it's control space. Control space will tab complete or whatever in here. IntelliSense, I guess they call it sometimes. bpy dot data dot objects, right? And then if I had something called cube, then it would show up here. Let me go ahead and add a cube. I think there's a cube there now. Okay, yeah. So here's the cube. And if I say, now if I do it, bpy.data.objects and then cube, then it gives me blue instead of red, and that's good. So bpy, I guess I should explain a little bit here. bpy is the main module that you import in your script. So if you scroll up to the top here, you'll notice that built-in modules, bpy, bpy.data, bpy.ops, bpy.props, blah, 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 blah. bpy is the main module you use to interact with Blender. I wanted to get at the actual cube object, right? And so what I did here was, using the submodule data, which has a dictionary sort of a thing called objects, I index into it by the cube, and then I got this thing. So if I were to say, well, C equals this, right? I can do all the normal Python things. Dir C, maybe not this. Oh, I guess you can. Dir help to get the doc string or whatever. The C dot name, right? I don't want it to be called cube. Let's call it something else. But first, let's review how you would do that traditionally. You'd come over here, you would click on this, double click on it, and then you would call it, I don't know, right? Something else. So you see that I changed the name of the object up here in the outliner. I think that's what this is called. Yeah, outliner. Or you could do it here, right? Here's another way to do it. And the data that Blender is kind of steward over changes. And anywhere that references it can see that change. So if I were to go c.name equals monster, right? You'll notice it changed here in the 3D view. Changed here in the object tab of the properties window. It changed here as well in your outliner. So, go ahead.
Can you show me how you instantiated C again?
Sure thing. I said, so bpy.data, which is a bpy struct. Then I say objects, which is a bpy collection. And if you're actually to make a list out of this, I think you can see there's a bpy data objects camera, bpy data objects lamp, bpy data objects monster. And so it's like a traditional Python dictionary. Actually, I should ask that. How many here are comfortable with Python? Okay, I'll keep that in mind. So are you comfortable with programming languages in general? Okay, so a dict in Python is like a hash in Perl or a hash map in PHP or yeah, so it's a key value sort of a store, right? So basically I index into this key value store by a string, and then it gives me it pops, it spits out the actual data. So now M is referencing this actual object. And you can do all sorts of things.
Okay, got it.
You got it? You can do all sorts of things. So all I showed was m.name equals, right? I showed you how to change the name, but then you can get access to all sorts of other things. So let's see. Mesh, I think, is one of them. We have to go bpy.data.mesh. Meshes.
If you do a dir on your object, it's a little easier to see
Is it?
what's part of it.
So my mesh, now here's the interesting thing, and I'm not going to delve into this in detail because it's one of those things that's just, I could spend another 3 hours just on this. But yesterday I talked about, I don't know why this is not zooming in more. Yesterday I talked about the object, and when you hit tab, you're dealing with the mesh, right? When you go into edit mode, you're dealing with the individual vertexes, edges, and faces of a mesh, right? So this might be a point of confusion. You're saying, well, you renamed it to Steven, and now you indexed into this bpy.data.meshes cube? Why'd you do that? I thought you renamed it to Steven. If you look here in the outliner, it'll be a little bit more clear. The object is called Steven. It contains a mesh that's still called cube, right? So if I'm sick of that, then I just say m.name equals Steven mesh. Oh, I did that wrong. m.name equals, there we are. So just to keep in mind, these are two different things. But all I really wanted to show you was this. So now that I have a reference, I guess you can call it, to this mesh object, I can do stuff to the vertices. Right? I can grab the vertices. If I make a list out of these, you'll see I've got 8 vertex objects, right? Makes sense. 4 on the top, 4 on the bottom makes 8. So if I were to grab a random one, zero, and I want to move it, then I can say dot, what do we got here? CO. Very, very obviously named, right? The CO is -1, -1, -1. And if I want to change 0 to equal 5, I can do that. Oh, and that's incorrect. Actually, I think I have to make a. Huh, no.
Just take the first one, so just reference all of them, rather than reference CO0.
No, he's just trying to move one point.
But I'm just trying to make this work here. Why didn't it move it? Oh, did it shift the whole cube? Oh, am I dealing with the object still? No, it's the mesh. And not vertices, 0. Oh, see, it's still that. I thought these were editable. There we go. Oh, if you missed that, that's too bad. Hold on a second. Let's do this again. -1, -1, -1. Forgive the PEP 8 violations. So, if I change it to 555, boosh. Right? So here I am, interacting with stuff in Blender in Python. So what are we going to do with this, right? So import urllib.open, or whatever, URL open, blah, 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 right? And we've got some server running Node.js who's connected to a MongoDB, and it presents this RESTful interface, right? So that we could say in our Blender script, oh, go and fetch me what points I should add. And you could store Blender objects off in the cloud, right? Check. I fulfilled the promise of Utah Open Source this year by talking about the cloud. You're free to go. You starting to see how awesome this is? Okay, cool. Now you see how awesome this is. Let's stop doing it here in the silly text editor and stop doing it here at the command line. Let's start some reusable scripts. Okay? The end game here, the point I want to get to, aside from making awesome boxes with points that go in the wrong direction, is I want to make a button here that does something. Okay? You think we can do that? I think we can. So, first of all, if you're interested in following along, in your preferred text editor at your desk, go ahead and clone this GitHub. GitHub S McQuay will it blend. I added some scripts last night. Okay. And I'll just be looking at those here. Vim scripts. And actually, I'm going to use Blender. I'm going to show you, so I've shown you so far how to use a text editor, click Run Script, run stuff in that console. Now let's say you've authored a Python script that you want Blender to run. This is how you do it. -P, and then some path to a script. Let's see what we've got in here. Simple operator. Oh gosh, let me make sure this is PEP 8. Okay. So what are we looking at here? This is just a traditional Python script with an import statement at the beginning. We're importing bpy. That's the module that'll give us access to all the interesting stuff. And then we define a class. But before we talk about what's inside of the class or what the class inherits from, let's look right here. At the very, very end, we say bpy.utils.register class my operator. So when Blender runs with a -P this script, it's going to suck in this class and it's going to register it so that I can use it in Blender. Now let's talk about what this class does. If you look at the execute function, which is what gets called when we go to use it, we print hello world. It's a little bit more convoluted than your traditional Python hello world, but hopefully this will sink in and start making sense. And apparently you return this finished set, it looks like. But the class that I'm defining, my operator, inherits from bpy.types.operator. What is an operator? An operator is anything that you can call in Blender. So when you start up Blender, let's look at this really quick. Dash P.
Are you talking to keeping that back a second?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Typing it in.
Alternatively, oh, you're typing in. Okay, alternatively, you could just clone the GitHub, or you could just download the file. Let me show you. Well, or just I'll wait. I can wait. We're going to run out of time pretty quick, but I can wait. Oh, yeah, that'll work. Let me do this.
What was the GitHub
There we
URL
go.
again?
So github.com /McQuay, Stephen McQuay /willitblend. And then if you look down here, then we got scripts,
Got it.
and you've got these simple ones. We're doing the simple operator right now. So you could just copy and paste this right here.
Yeah,
Got it?
could have.
Okay, so back to this. All I'm going to do is I'm going to start Blender. Simple operator, like that, right? The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to watch this to make sure that nothing blew up and nothing got dumped to my terminal. So far, so good. Then you may ask, okay, great. Well, let's remember what this thing is called. It's called my awesome operator. Okay. And let me take a moment to talk about this. There are a bunch of these special class level variables that you can define that specify behavior or name what your operator is called for future use. So you'll notice here I've defined two, and I believe this is the minimum you need. The BLID name, so this I think is what you end up using inside of scripts, and the BL label. Blender I think is the prefix. That's what it's supposed to mean. My awesome operator. Okay. And while we're here, let me tangent a little bit to talk about the state of Blender Python API and resources and what have you. Because the API is kind of in flux, and by kind of I mean it's changing quite a bit. It's only getting better, I guess that's the good news. But the documentation, I would have to say I've read better documentation, including like the actual Blender user manual. But all this stuff is more or less documented. It's just kind of hard to follow. And I'll show you how to get there. But they talk about the importance of these things, but when you try to look for a complete list of all the ones you can specify for different classes, I don't know, I had trouble surfing the docs, but maybe we'll spend 5 minutes at the end just kind of looking at what's there. Anyhow, but what you need to remember is this my awesome operator. Because in Blender, you have the spacebar thing, right? You can type anything in here, cube, and it looks through all of the operators and then lets you select them from here. So let's go awesome. I've got my awesome operator here. When I click on it and check the terminal, guess what I got?
How do you get it to import that script in Windows?
-P. Same thing.
Just with that. Okay. All right.
You launch Blender from the cmd.exe and specify the -P. Now, there are other ways that are superior, well, that are different, I should say.
Yeah, you remember the command line.
But yeah,
But then my command line disappears for
Yeah.
some reason.
it's a setting that you can set. But let's not worry. Well,
Yeah, don't worry about it. Keep going.
We can figure that out.
so we've defined an operator. This did something useful, right? You could print something else. You could fetch a URL. You could grab bpy.objects. Blah 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 and do stuff in here. Let's see, Vim scripts. Okay. But I would venture to say that it's a little bit annoying to have to launch Blender every single time with this -p with the absolute path to a single script, right? Not the most efficient way to do it. So I'm going to show you another way to get your scripts into Blender. This 2.63 directory, which once again in Linux, it's in your home directory /.blender/2.63, has a script subdirectory. And each of these subdirectories has a different use. And I believe that what I'm going to show you is not absolutely right, but is functional. So I'll refer you to those docs, or to like pound Blender coders or something like that on Freenode. But I did startup, and then you'll see dump.py.
Just so you know, it's under help toggle system console in Windows.
Oh, it is? Oh, cool, like in Blender itself, and it'll pull it back up. Very cool. Thank you. So if you actually Vim this guy up, you'll see it's one that I've authored that we'll get to in the end, right? So what I typically do, because I've got my code in some repository, right? I'll just do a symlink. Source, will it blend? Let's see, scripts. Hold on a second. For in. Yeah, ignore this for a second. Do 2.60 scripts startup. So all I've done is nothing. Hold on a second.
Anyway, you were going to add
Oh.
in Blender.
Anyways.
And scripts to go to your script. So
I'm going to do is a symlink of my scripts into that special directory so that Blender can pick them up when it starts up. So let me just do that really quick. Will it blend scripts? So simple operator, we'll start with that one. 2.63 scripts startup. So now, I killed Blender, right? Oh yeah. Now when I just start up Blender, oh, interesting. Running bleeding edge Blender might actually bite me today. Okay, no, there we are. No -p, no pulling up the text editor, copy paste. Blender just found it and did the right thing, right? So now when I click on my awesome operator, it does hello world. That's what I would suggest doing, right? Have your scripts under version control somewhere, symlink those scripts into the version number /script/startup, and then it will show up every time you open Blender.
I'll try to figure out how that's done.
Okay, yeah. Or if you want to find out the right way. I remember telling somebody I did it this way in IRC, and they said, well, actually, and so it worked, and so I continued on my merry way because I was trying to prepare for this presentation. And I wanted to have something working, something to show. So now I've got all of that stuff in there. Oh, and actually, dang it. I wanted to work up to this eventually, but oh good, it's not here. Oh, I just symlinked the one. Okay. So ls 2.63 script startup, and you'll see all I have is my dump.py and my simple operator. Well, let's symlink something else. Let's symlink simple panel. Okay? Because in all honesty, I mean, I'm okay with doing this space thing and doing awesome operator and clicking enter, right? But wouldn't it be nicer if you can come over here in the side and have like a little button that you could push? These things are called So 2.63 scripts, startup, simple. They're called panels. So this should look more or less familiar. Import bpy. Define a class that inherits from something in bpy. Define a bunch of these BL variables. Define a function or two, and then register it, right? So very similar shape to that last script that we wrote. But this time, some key differences. Imports bpy.types.panel. Okay? This should look familiar. ID name, right? ID label. So now I think if I were to do actually, I don't know. Anyway, I believe this has to be unique across the entire. No, sorry. This, let me run it, right? And then talk about it so we can.
Okay, how did we find you again on GitHub?
S McQuay, SMCQUAY. So github.com/SMCQUAY. And then this one is the will it blend. QUAY.
SMCQUAY.
SMCQUAY. So basically, oh, here it is. What I've done is, you'll see up here there's this thing called serfs with this button in it, right?
Show me that again. Oh, there it is.
Up here in the top. So what we're looking at, I should have given some context to the code we were looking at, but we're trying to get this thing here in the side panel. Okay? Yeah. So here's the ID, serfs. This is what happens in that little expandable, collapsible thing. Oh, this is the one that I messed up. This was also supposed to just be a simple hello world sort of a thing, but it's not. But you can basically say, where should this go? It should be in the 3D view. In which region? It should be in the tools region. Right? So let's see, what does that look like again? Here's the 3D view, right? Here's the tools region. And what this poll method does is it lets Blender know, should I actually do anything with it? Are we in the proper context? And this code just basically says, as long as the context, as long as something is selected, as long as an object is selected, then go ahead and show that button. So you'll notice, hey, where'd my stuff go? I thought I added it in here. Well, if you actually select something, then it shows up there. Or if you go add a cube, then it shows up there, right? So if you give me a second, I had a more hello world version of this. Let me see. Scripts. Is it medium panel? Yeah, apparently it's medium panel. My hello world one was broken, but let me just do a medium panel one. Scripts, startup, simple. So I'm getting rid of my simple operators. Now when I start up Blender, here we are. I didn't want to start with the button. I wanted to start with this one here. Here's my hello world panel. Right? It displays the name of the currently selected object. See, I'm selecting objects and it's changing. And it allows you to change that name. It changes down here in the 3D window. It changes up here in the object, in the, I always forget the name of this thing, the outliner. Right? And it changes here in the, so you can change anywhere now from You can change that name here, or here, or here, or go into the Python script menu and change it there, and it changes globally, right? Not too much black magic. Let's look at that code. Scripts, startup, medium panel. Okay. Import bpy again, register at the bottom, and defining a class that imports from bpy.types.panel. Define a bunch of these special Blender variables. These two dictate where it shows up. This one dictates the text that goes by the little swivel that expands it and tracks it.
I figured out how to do it in English.
Okay.
Yeah, you just put it in scripts/startup
And it's just there? Okay.
Is,
Yeah?
is draw an inherited method for panel?
Yes. This one that you're overwriting. And then poll to let it know whether it should be rendered or not. And then here we are. Here's the fun stuff. So basically we say, context, give me the object that's been selected. Obj. All right? And then we use self.layout to create a couple of things. Self.layout.row creates this little row object. You can set the label on that row object to be object name, right? Text equals some string. Icon equals some string. And there's a list in the documentation that I finally found of all the things that can go in here. I chose world because, well, hello world, right? So it's a little world icon. Then you get another row. You say row.prop is the object, see that you got on line 10, and you want the name property from that object. So it does all the GUI linking, right, to say, to do to make it so that when you change this field, it actually changes it on the object. And then from there, Blender takes care of making sure that it changes everywhere else it needs to change.
Show me the script again.
Sure thing. So all we did was you say this row thing, which is of type, and we can look that up in the document in the documentation in a second, of some Python type, has this property function that takes the first parameter is an object, the second parameter is a string that is the property, right? The Blender property. And then that makes all the linkages to make sure that you can change it there, it changes everywhere. Okay, when do we have to end? Is it 10:02 or do we end on the hour?
Let's go to the hour.
Okay.
Next class doesn't start till 11:15.
It says an hour.
Oh, then we'll go to the hour. Okay, okay.
I just find it interesting that they put that as a method of a row object.
Yeah, it's a little bit convoluted. I'm still learning how to do it.
So the row is referring to the panel, right? A row of the panel?
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, you see it's self.layout, right? Self is the actual panel. It has this layout thing inside of it, and then that layout thing has a row function that will return a row, and I'm assuming behind the scenes it creates a row and keeps track of all your rows and lays them out, etc., etc.
Probably just a different layout manager. Because in the notice,
Sorry, Steve, script one more time.
Oh, 1 second. Let me see. Okay, I've got it in here. Yeah, I'm sorry I'm not explaining this super well. This one is basically just
You know what? It's
the
on
hello world that's on the...
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a hello world that's on the Blender docs. I'll show you where that is in a second. But let's say you want to do something useful, right? Like let's say, for example, McQuay, source, will it blend? So those who came yesterday will recognize this guy. The Mighty Easter Bunny. My wife made these for our kids, and so I thought, anyway, I used it because it was a fairly relatively simple thing to render, to mesh up in Blender. So there he is, right? So I'm in the middle of writing a library for Python to add subdivision surface schemes to SciPy. to test that out, rather than hand code, right, some JSON files or whatever with vertex, edge, and face data inside of it, right? Because I'm not really as good at punching in numbers in Vim as I am at pushing vertices around in Blender. I created a little operator, right, to use the terminology we learned earlier, called dump mesh. It brings up this this dialog. Defaults. I forgot I did this. It defaults the name of the object here, names it .json. Then you put it wherever you want. So I'll just dump it and put it there, and then let's go look at it. Okay. That's useless. Okay, so here's a simple, I guess object is the right JavaScript term, that has, you know, key values, edges, which is just a list of indices, edges, faces. The most interesting one is down here is the vertices, right? So here are, when I get to the top, wow, there's a lot of vertices in this bunny. There we are, vertices, which is a list of lists, right? So it's a 2D array of point. And similarly, so the index into this one, so this is point 0, point 1. Something in the edges list is going to be first point, second point, right? So it would be 0, 1. And then if I wanted to join this point with this point and create an edge, it would be 1, 2, so on and so forth. So that's the information that's encoded here in the edges. So 51, 1 means take the 51st vertex, take the 1th vertex, and create an edge out of those. Similar with faces, right? Faces is a collection of 4 vertices. Index 51, 49, 2, and 1. Cool? So just so you have some background before we start looking at this script. To know what the end game is, what we're trying to do. So this one's a bit more complicated, and this one I did following a tutorial or something that's in the Blender documentation. I would do this one a little bit differently. Imports at the top, registers at the bottom, and then I've defined this function, dump mesh to JSON. Let's not worry about the contents yet. And then this object called dump mesh. Okay? Dump mesh should look a little bit familiar, right? Inherit from some of the bpy stuff. Specify some of these variables. Define some methods, right? Pull and execute. And it's feasible, one second. It's feasible to I mean, you can imagine now when I run it into execute, I'm just going to be calling this function. So when I run this operator, this is the code that gets called. Dump mesh to JSON is defined above. Okay? We're seeing how that all links together. What's your question?
It's not important.
Okay. Okay. This code exists on surfaces. My account on GitHub /surfaces. If you want to actually pull it up on your own. A couple of interesting things. Export helper, which is at the very top here. From bpyextras.io utils import export helper. That's what made it so that it did some clever things. File name, I believe that's what makes it so when you define this file name extension, it defaults to saying .json instead of .text or nothing. I guess Blender just decided to use the object name, so bunny.json. It did that automatically. But I mean, this is the kind of the idea of what you do, right? You specify filter glob, for example. If something of type export helper has a filter glob variable set on it, then it uses it, right? .json. So what you would have noticed is even if I tried to dump that JSON file into a directory that was full of files, image files, text files, C++ header files, whatever, the only files that would show up there would be the JSON files. And the way you specify that is with one of these things. Oh, in fact, here I've specified options is a set, I think. I'm not super good with Python 3. I think this is set notation. Hidden. So it automatically sets in the file browser whether you should be showing hidden files or not.
That's a dictionary.
It's a dictionary? Well, usually dictionaries have string colon something, right?
Oh,
It's key value, right? So
okay, sorry.
I don't know either. Anyway, but this thing is all over the place, right? You return one of these here in the execute. It's there in the options. So are you guys kind of seeing what the big picture is here? Let's look at this actual dump to JSON. Actually, let's not do that. Let's look at execute. Execute is passed in a context. And dump to JSON basically gets that same context, which is basically what the user has selected, right? And this self.file path, which is another one of these things that are hidden away in export helper, right? So here we are, dump to JSON gets that same context. The first thing I do, because, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the bmesh thing on this object. It's going to actually have the vertices, the connectivity information, etc. But in order for me to grab that, I have to first change modes, right? So Blender modes, that means Blender. That means that I have to come in here, right? So I say add cube. Now I'm in object mode. If I change that to edit mode, now I'm in a mode where I can actually grab that mesh information and use it. Okay? So let me show you how you do that programmatically. So context.object basically, right, context is what the user has selected. .object is the object that the user has selected. .mode is the mode that object is in. Well, if it's in object mode, which is not what we want, let's change it. So you do bpy.ops.object, which is that same object, the cube in with what I was doing in the interface. Mode set, mode equals edit. The API feels a little bit, I don't know. It's nice to have. I'm sure it's better than how it's been, but I don't know. I would have done that a bit differently. Anyway, so I say context.object.data, and I get this little, the actual mesh, I believe. And then bmesh, which is a different thing you have to import. Bmesh is part of the Blender. It's one of the default modules that comes in Blender. You import bmesh, and you say bmesh from edit mesh, and you pass in the edit mesh. And all of a sudden, you've got what you want. This B is what I was trying to hunt for. I couldn't have done that had I not switched to edit mode. And I couldn't have done that, well, you had to get the mesh first and then pass that in, and it gives you this bmesh thing now. So if we were to run a type on this B, then you'd see, oh, it's this bmesh type. I can do interesting things. Like, for example, I can say b.verts, and I get a list of the vertices, the vertexes, right? And I can say, so all I do here is I traverse the structure. I say, make a list comprehension. So I'm making a list. Each thing in there is going to be a list, right? I just listify this vert.co, which gives me that tuple 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, -1, 1, so on and so forth. Out of everything, for vert in b.verts. That's Python syntax. That's Python syntax. I'm traversing b.verts, converting it into a list, and then storing it in data, which is an empty dictionary, at the vertices key. So basically, rinse and repeat. I do the same thing for edges for any given vert, faces for any given vert. I get all the edges and store them in data edges, faces for edge. I'm just traversing B, all the different things that B contains. B has edges, B has verts, verts have link edges, verts have link faces. And basically, I'm pulling that apart and then storing that into a dictionary, which in the very end, I've got this big dictionary. I just do a JSON dump, right into file path, which was the file path that the Blender machinery stored from what the user had entered in earlier, right?
JSON.dump is just a native Python.
It's a, yeah, import JSON is up above, and yeah, you'll dump, yeah. So it dumps that into JSON for me, and then the last thing I do is, because I don't want to leave the user stranded in edit mode, I set the mode for my object back to object mode. So really what that thing is doing, you could do interactively, right? You can come in here, you can grab each of these vertices, write them down, put them into a text editor as JSON, and then come back out of edit mode. But that takes a long time, and instead, now you just go dump mesh. Right. ASDF.json. Oh, here, recent. Will it blend? Right next to Bunny, I'll dump the mesh. Vim. ASDF.json, and here we are, much smaller. That's all the information from that cube. Which, okay, so you may be asking, well, what are you doing with this? Well, I use that information in that JSON file, run some of my algorithms in it in native Python, and then dump that back to a JSON object that Blender can then load and display. Okay, so let's look at the load code really quick. Actually, we don't have time. What I want to do is now, instead of making the user press space, I want to just click on a button here. Select an object, click on a button, and then it lets me dump stuff to the file. Okay? So how do you do that? Is it both? So the main line here is, this is a panel class that I'm defining, right? You say self.layout.operator, and then you give it a string, which is one of those BL_ID or something, right? How do you get at that? And now, that button, this will give you a button that is bound to that operator. So if you look now, my operator is down here, BL.ID name, object.myOperator. So you notice this string is the same as this string. What Blender will do is Blender will say, in this layout, I'm adding a button that maps to this guy, and then it will use what it finds here. This one is another just hello world, right? Oh.
Is there a whole interface written in Python? Or
That's a good question. It's all written in C. It's written in C++, but it's configured and the layout is done in Python. So if you actually go into that directory,
so they
you
set
can
up their buttons the exact same way you are.
Yeah, precisely. So yeah, I'm being critical. I'm being a little bit critical about the API, but I'd venture to say they've had some experience with this, right? So maybe I'm being too critical. So here is my panel. I have no button. That's sad. Oh, I bet it's because of this. I bet there's namespace collision. There we are. There was a namespace collision. They both have the same ID. The first one won, right? But now I can say my awesome operator, when I click on this, some hello worlds. Come on. Right? Great. So in the last 5 minutes, do we want to try and add my dump file as a button?
You're going to show them the documentation.
Let's do the documentation. That's more important. OK, so where do we go to learn about this stuff?
I want to see what you did and then re-imported. What cool stuff you did to the mesh. Like,
Oh, yeah. That. When I'm done writing that code, then I'll do a presentation on it. How's that sound? Yeah, I can talk to you about it afterward. It's going to be, it'll be cool. So I always just do this. And Blender, Python, API. Click on the first link. It generally takes you to the most recent version of it. These guys here are good to read through, give you a good overview. Actually, it's all pretty good to read. Some of it goes over beginning Python stuff that you would get in a normal Python tutorial or from knowing how to use Python, but it's good. Good for beginners. Here's information about the operators, here's information about the data, so on and so forth, the utility functions. I'm trying to think of what I used this morning. I wanted to find out what the different strings I could use in that icon, right? They use the world one in the hello world, and I wanted to use a different one. I think I went to like bpython. No, it wasn't data, it was operators. .ops. No, it wasn't here. I think I went to modules. Oh, here, it lists them all out, and then you come down here and you can see bpy.props, right? And this traditional Python documentation with examples, the entire API listed out and what have you. So that's how you learn about stuff. Any questions? Let's try. I do kind of want to show you this one. Oh. Vim, both, and dump. Right? All you have to do to get my code working with that button that we set up is change this object.myOperator. Object.myOperator, if you remember, is referencing this object.myOperator BLID name. Mine has a BLID name as well, called object.dumpMesh. So if you change this guy to be .dumpMesh, right? Let's go ahead and get rid of this myOperator stuff. Let's get rid of this. Whatever. We'll let the user be able to change the name of the object. Right? Now I can change this to bunny. Doesn't look anything like a bunny. Dump mesh, and all of a sudden that code that I wrote that I tested, using as a simple operator, space, typing the name of the operator in, works as expected. Will it blend from button? So if I wanted a dump mesh and a load mesh, right, I would make sure that my load mesh code was imported, add it there, and I would have both those buttons right there. Questions?
Can you just run it and show us the buttons?
Oh, show the load one? Yeah. Let's see, ln-s source surfaces Blender. Oh, hold on a second. Load. And then now I can come here and I can say, well, actually I want this to show up all the time, so I'd have to change that. But load mesh, will it blend bunny? There it is. Right, you'd have to take the mesh and then add the operators that I had before, right? Mirror, subdivision surface, and here we are. But all my code does is deal with the actual mesh geometry, vertices, edges, and faces. So what I would do eventually is, right now I've got this dump mesh, load mesh business. I'm going to have one button. You click the button. It makes a HTTP connection to a server that presents a RESTful interface to my library. It crunches all the numbers and spits JSON back at this, and then it loads it back up, and seamless, right? None of this saving to file. Anyhow, that's it. I hope this was educational. I hope that you learned something.